Bloomberg Audio Studios. Podcasts, radio, news.
This is the Bloomberg Daybreak Europe podcast. Good morning. It's Tuesday, the 7th of October. I'm Caroline Hepker in London.
And I'm Stephen Carroll in Paris, where President Macron has given his outgoing Prime Minister 48 hours to negotiate a deal to salvage the government as the political uncertainty hits France's stocks and bonds.
And in other news, Citadel's Ken Griffin says he's really concerned that investors are starting to view gold as a safer asset than the US dollar. Plus, facing a fork in the road, why the UK government's £1.5 billion Jaguar Land Rover bailout is a high-risk move. Let's start with a roundup of our top stories. France's President Emmanuel Macron has given his outgoing Prime Minister Sebastien Lecornu until Wednesday to negotiate a last-ditch deal to prevent a deeper crisis. The decision buys the President a little more time to decide his next steps, which could include fresh legislative elections, something opposition groups are demanding. Lecornu unexpectedly resigned yesterday, blaming gridlock among rival parties, including his own centrist group.
The various political parties continue to take a stance as though each had an absolute majority in the National Assembly. And in the end, I found myself in a situation where I was ready to compromise. But each political party wanted the others to adopt its entire program.
Outgoing Prime Minister Sebastien Lecornu speaking there via a translator. The government now faces the very real prospect of missing an October the 13th deadline to pass a budget. Failure to do so raises the risk of emergency measures to avoid a shutdown in January. France's gridlock is fueling a sell-off of French assets and driving up the country's borrowing costs relative to peers. France's yield premium over German 10-year debt closed at about 85 basis points yesterday, the highest since early January. The CAC 40 index also lost 1.4% yesterday as banks took the biggest hit. Meanwhile, over in the US, President Trump says that he will negotiate with Democrats over healthcare subsidies, which could help resolve the government shutdown. Speaking to reporters, he predicted some cooperation between the two parties with the government shutdown in its second week.
We are speaking with the Democrats, and some very good things could happen with respect to health care. I'd like to see a deal made for great health care. Yeah, I want to see great health. I'm a Republican, but I want to see health care much more so than the Democrats.
Donald Trump speaking there. Previously, Republican leaders insisted that Democrats needed to vote to reopen the government before they would engage in negotiations over health insurance tax credits. Responding to the apparent shift, Senate Democratic leader Chuck Schumer said his party is ready to make it happen if Republicans want to collaborate on health care. Later today, the Senate will vote for the fifth time on a stopgap bill to keep the US government open through to the end of the 21st of November. Citadel's Ken Griffin says investors are starting to see gold as safer than the US dollar. The billionaire founder of one of the world's most profitable hedge funds warned many are looking again at the US's safe haven status.
As you see sovereigns around the world, as you see central banks around the world, as you see individual investors around the world go, you know what? I now view gold as a safe harbor asset in a way that the dollar used to be viewed. That's what's really concerning to me.
In the wide-ranging interview with Bloomberg's Francine Lacqua, Griffin also said the Trump administration had given, quote, a lot of love to and a lot to hate. The US government shutdown and potential future rate cuts have pushed gold to another record high on Monday, close to $4,000 an ounce. AI firms have continued their rally, leading the US stocks to a record close yesterday. Shares in global semiconductor company AMD surged as much as 38% after it signed a deal with OpenAI to build infrastructure. Greg Brockman, president and co-founder of OpenAI, said there's still room for growth in the sector.
I think that the world continues to underestimate the amount of demand for AI compute. right? That just, we've seen this explosion of demand with things like ChatGPT. We're at 800 million weekly active users now. This product didn't even exist 3 years ago. And we're in a position where we cannot launch features, we cannot launch new products simply because of lack of computational power. And we see these models continuing to get exponentially better. And I think we're just heading to a world where so much of the economy is going to be lifted up and driven by progress in AI.
So that was OpenAI's Greg Brockman speaking there. The deal also sets the stage for OpenAI to acquire a large stake in AMD. Meanwhile, OpenAI's mentions of other firms at its annual developers event yesterday boosted shares, with companies like Figma, HubSpot and Salesforce seeing gains. Now to the UK. The Bank of England Governor Andrew Bailey says that Britain has to spend more if it wants to see any AI gains. The central banker told an audience of investors that he believes AI could be the answer to Britain's productivity woes if the country commits to technological change. Bloomberg's James Wilcock has more.
The head of Britain's central bank thinks AI might be the edge of a technological breakthrough which will put a rocket under economic growth. It's rare to hear such optimism from a central banker speaking in Scotland rather than Silicon Valley, but that positivity has an edge. To take advantage, Bailey says, Britain needs the right infrastructure, the right mindset and the right people. Currently, the UK spends less on improving its capital than almost all other G7 peers. Andrew Bailey says he hopes coming changes to pension fund rules might change that. In London, James Wilcock, Bloomberg Radio.
And those are our top stories for you this morning. Let's update you on the market. So gold was up by 1.9% on Monday. The run-up in bullion. Goldman Sachs forecasting an even bigger gain for next year. 4,900 is their target for December 2026. Asian equities climbing to a fresh record high. Japanese shares extending their rally. You got tech shares up after that AMD deal. Also, you had a firm auction for Japanese 30-year sovereign bonds. So that helped. Stock futures, though, in Europe expected to be very active, especially for France. US Stocks 50 futures, though, sinking this morning. US stock futures are also in the red right now. So those are the markets. Now, Stephen Cowell, you're back in Paris, I think rather sooner than you or any of us really imagined. Good morning.
Good morning. Yeah, I don't think when we were here a month ago that we thought we would be back so quickly to see another Prime Minister on the brink of leaving the job, being back in the job again, and us heading towards perhaps a deeper precipice of the political crisis here as well. It all happened very quickly. If you think about, the cabinet was only named on Sunday night, and yesterday morning we brought you the news that Sebastien Lecornu had resigned, and then only for later in the day for him to be given essentially a temporary reprieve, an extra 48 hours to try and do a deal with the other parties as well. Things moving pretty quickly here.
Yeah, absolutely. We were surprised when we broke the news yesterday, weren't we? Well, this 48 hours, what is Lecornu expected to be able to achieve in that time? And Stephen, crucially, what happens if there's no deal?
First of all, he has to try and get his former partners back on board. That was at the root of his resignation yesterday morning. Essentially, they were unhappy with the lineup of the cabinet, particularly the return of the likes of Bruno Le Maire, the former finance minister who was appointed to the defence ministry. And that is where Sebastien Lecornu felt he could go no further. He couldn't advance on their key project, which was, of course, getting a budget passed. So the meetings start this morning with the centre-right parties. The current interior minister, or outgoing interior minister, depending on your point of view, Bruno Retailleau, who's the leader of the Republicans, won't be there. He said he wants to speak directly to the Prime Minister and doesn't want to take part in a wider meeting. But essentially, he has to get them back on board first to try and rebuild, I suppose, the point that he started from when he became Prime Minister around a month ago. From there, he then has to get back to the substantive issue of trying to build some sort of consensus around budget and spending plans. Now, in his resignation speech yesterday, Sebastien Lecornu talked about how in private some parties were showing signs of perhaps some flexibility on their red lines, but he had criticised opposition parties, but also the centrist Macronist bloc members for not being on board with some of the key proposals they had to make. So that's where the talks are starting from today. He has until Wednesday evening. That's when he said he will tell President Macron on whether or not sufficient progress has been made to be able to go forward. The question of who is coming before the question of what exactly they're going to try to agree on.
Yeah, absolutely. So where does this leave President Macron? I mean, how much is his future in doubt?
Look, the short-term decision is going to be what happens if there is no deal by tomorrow evening. The likelihood, or at least the option that would appear most likely in that situation, would be that there would be fresh elections to the National Assembly. And that's something that Emmanuel Macron is wielding as a threat over all of the centrist parties, from the centre-left to the centre-right, because he knows that none of those parties are, according to current polling, set to do very well. In fact, they could end up all losing quite a lot of seats to the political extremes. And that would be the fear that he's hoping will motivate them into coming to some sort of agreement. For Macron himself, he does, of course, have the option of resigning. He's always ruled it out before. There's no indication that that position has changed. He still has a term that runs until 2027. And for now, at least, it doesn't look like he's going anywhere.
Yeah, OK. So then how should we read the market reaction? I mentioned the stock drop and the widening yield spread. How do you think that markets have reacted so far?
Look, so Lecornu's resignation was a shock, and that's what we saw playing out on markets yesterday. If we think about the widening of the yield spread, we got to levels that were close to what we saw in December of last year, when there was a real budget deadline where it looked like that France would go into their emergency measures at the end of last year, as they did very briefly before a budget was eventually agreed. When you look at the stock sell-off, it's on stocks that are focused on the domestic French economy. This isn't something that's having spillover into other economies just yet. It's also, and this is something that our own economists at Bloomberg Economics have pointed out before, this is not a fiscal crisis yet. This is a political crisis, and that is how markets are reading it for now. There still is time, although we talked about that October 13th deadline, which is the legal deadline to present a budget to Parliament. There is some flexibility of what do you do if you go past that point as well. The European Commission in Brussels will be watching closely as well. They're also expecting to get spending plans from the French government. But ultimately, there is a budget that runs until the end of this year. And we saw what happened last year. If you didn't have a new spending plan in place by the end of the year, it's not a government shutdown. There are certain effects in terms of how tax credits will roll over into the next year. But essentially, the lights stay on. And no political party has ever expressed an interest in trying to block anything that would stop that happening, would stop welfare payments being paid or taxes being collected as well. So we're not in a fiscal crisis yet, but that doesn't mean that there won't be market pressure on the politicians to get some sort of deal done.
Yeah, really fascinating. Stephen Cowell, thank you so much for your reporting live from Paris for us this morning. I also really liked, and I know you've read it, of course, our colleague Lionel Laurent, opinion columnist, talking about lame duck Macron is now a French sitting duck. So he's got a lot more in terms of his views on Emmanuel Macron, the last chance man, how he's going to keep his presidency on the rails through to 2027. But for now, Stephen, thank you so much for being with us. We're going to hear from you throughout the day. Thanks. Stay with us. More from Bloomberg Daybreak Europe coming up after this. OK, let's turn our attention to some business news today. You may remember that in late August, Jaguar Land Rover was hit by a major cyber attack. It led to them shutting down manufacturing sites across the world. And in an unprecedented move, the British government stepped in. They agreed to guarantee a £1.5 billion emergency loan to the company so that it could pay its suppliers. But experts are now warning that that move could set a risky precedent. Our global business reporter, William Wilkes, has been writing about this. William, good morning. Just firstly on the cyber attack, this has been rumbling on for weeks. How sophisticated was this attack?
It seems fairly sophisticated. A kind of disparate group of hackers managed to get into Jaguar Land Rover systems and disrupt everything from deliveries, software, through to kind of production. So it's difficult to compare it yet while all the details aren't out, comparing it to other hacks, but there is certainly a deep degree of sophistication and technical knowledge on behalf of the hackers.
So then, In terms of the UK government having to step in and the warnings around risks, what is that risk? How do you see it?
So the government has stepped in to help the hundreds of smaller suppliers, to help Jaguar Land Rover, and it's hoped that help will cascade down to smaller suppliers to secure them. And the risk there, there's a couple of risks there, I think. Firstly, there's a kind of a moral hazard risk. It seems possible that Jaguar Land Rover didn't have the very best in cyber defense practice and protocols. And people are asking the question, does the government then, extending a loan, incentivize companies not to do the best they can to defend themselves if the government's always there to bail them out? And then there's another concern that perhaps this shows hackers that they can be more aggressive, because the companies will always pay, knowing that the government in the end will bail them out. So these hackers have used ransomware you have to send a payment to them to unlock your software. And by making this loan, has it made it more likely that companies will pay up and pass the financial problem on to the government?
This is Bloomberg Daybreak Europe, your morning brief on the stories making news from London to Wall Street and beyond.
Look for us on your podcast feed every morning on Apple, Spotify and anywhere else you get your podcasts.
You can also listen live each morning on London DAB Radio, the Bloomberg Business app and Bloomberg.com.
Our flagship New York station is also available on your Amazon Alexa devices. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130. I'm Caroline Hepker.
And I'm Stephen Carroll. Join us again tomorrow morning for all the news you need to start your day, right here on Bloomberg Daybreak Europe.